Welcome to the deep dive. We're thrilled you're here with us today because today we're taking on a mission that is going to fundamentally rewire how you look at the modern world. You are someone who is insanely curious about how things work. I mean, you wouldn't be listening if you weren't, but if you're anything like me, you are probably exhausted by the standard wait, let me take a step back.
Sure.
You're probably exhausted by the highly politically charged debates about the global economy. We hear the exact same talking points endlessly repeated on the news. Free markets versus state control, capitalism versus communism, deregulation versus heavy government intervention.
Right. It's a constant loop.
Exactly. But what if the historical reality of how a country actually goes from crushing poverty to immense wealth doesn't fit neatly into any of those ideological boxes? What if the standard economic theories we're taught in university textbooks are actually entirely missing the most crucial foundational step?
It is a question that challenges the very bedrock of modern economic thought. And the answers we're going to explore today are surprisingly tangible. We are pulling our insights from a highly acclaimed, meticulously researched book by Joe Studwell called How Asia Works.
Success and failure in the world's most dynamic region.
That's the one. Studwell has spent decades analyzing the raw data, the granular history, and the specific policies of Asian nations. Our mission in this deep dive is to cut entirely through all that ideological noise. We want to uncover the highly specific three-step recipe that actually built the Asian economic miracle.
The actual blueprint.
Exactly. The goal here is to give you a masterclass in global development, explaining precisely why certain countries skyrocketed from dire poverty to unimaginable wealth, while their neighbors who started with the exact same advantages after the Second World War failed, stagnated, and in some tragic cases, slid completely backward.
By the end of this conversation, you are going to look at agriculture, at factories, and at the entire banking system in a completely new light. It's going to change how you understand wealth generation from the absolute ground up.
Okay.
Let's unpack this. Studwell presents a very specific three-part blueprint for rapid economic transformation. And the wild thing is, it's deeply counterintuitive.
Highly counterintuitive.
It goes against almost everything we assume about modern efficiency.
Yeah.
So what exactly are these three steps?
Well, the recipe is strictly sequential, meaning the order absolutely matters. You cannot skip a step. Step one, and this is by far the most overlooked intervention by traditional economists, is to maximize output from agriculture. But you do not do this by industrializing the farms.
Right, no big tractors.
No, you do it by fundamentally restructuring farming into highly labor-intensive, small-scale household plots.
Okay, so that's step one. What's step two?
Step two, once you have secured that booming agricultural base, is to meticulously direct your investment and your domestic entrepreneurs into manufacturing. But crucially, you don't just hand them government subsidies. You apply what Studwell calls export discipline.
Export discipline, meaning you force them to perform.
Right. You force these fledgling companies to compete on the unforgiving global market to survive. And finally, step three is exerting strict control over the financial sector so that it serves the first two goals. You essentially keep capital on a very short leash, ensuring the banking system funds agricultural yields and manufacturing technology upgrades, rather than allowing it to chase, say, short-term consumer debt or speculative real estate bubbles.
And when we look at the map of Asia today, Studwell essentially divides the entire region into two distinct groups based on who actually followed this blueprint and who ignored it. You have the highly successful Northeast Asian states, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and eventually China.
The massive winners.
Right. And then contrasting sharply with them, you have the lagging Southeast Asian states. We're talking Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. If we rewind the clock to right after World War II, all of these countries were remarkably similar in their extreme poverty levels. They were all agrarian societies decimated by conflict or colonialism. But their trajectories just couldn't be more different today. Why was there such a stark divergence?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to deeply understand the intellectual and political environment in which these countries were trying to develop, particularly throughout the 1980s and 1990s. This was the undisputed era of the Washington Consensus.
The era of deregulation.
Exactly. Major global institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. Treasury, they were entirely united in pushing a very specific ideology onto the developing world. They argued that strict, laissez-faire, free market policies with absolutely minimal government intervention were the singular, proven path to achieve rapid economic development.
But that wasn't what was actually happening in Asia.
Not at all. The economists at the World Bank essentially looked at the soaring success of the Asian miracle and erroneously attributed it entirely to free market capitalism. In doing so, they deliberately ignored the sweeping, heavy-handed state interventions and the radical agricultural restructuring that actually took place in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan.
Wait, I have to stop you there. If the World Bank had all the economic data, how did they get the analysis so entirely wrong? I mean, how do the smartest economists in the room completely miss the actual mechanism of wealth creation?
It came down to a fundamental, deeply flawed methodological choice. To prove their free market theories, the World Bank relied heavily on analyzing the economic data of places like Hong Kong and Singapore.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they held these up as the shining beacons of deregulation and low taxes. But comparing the economic engine of Hong Kong to a vast, sprawling country like Indonesia is an egregious analytical error. Hong Kong and Singapore are offshore financial centers. They are essentially deeply densely populated city-states.
Right, they don't have millions of impoverished rural peasants living in a sprawling agricultural sector that drags down national productivity. They're microstates that operate with entirely different structural overheads. It's like It's like comparing the operating budget of a single boutique software startup in Silicon Valley to the sprawling, complex budget of the entire state of California.
That's a great analogy.
And then confidently declaring that the state of California should just run itself exactly like the
Such a
startup.
big word.
It completely ignores the profound reality of what it actually takes to govern a proper country with a vast rural population.
Precisely. You simply cannot formulate sweeping development policy for a country of 100 million people based on the highly specific economic behavior of a densely populated deepwater port city.
And this fundamentally flawed analysis led to dangerous, real-world policy recommendations. The World Bank and the IMF strongly advise Southeast Asian countries to rapidly deregulate their financial markets, to open their borders to foreign capital flows, and to completely ignore state-led industrial and agricultural planning.
And that's dangerous because the inherent danger here is that it is extraordinarily easy to be fooled by temporary periods of high economic growth.
Give me an example of that. Where has that illusion of growth actually caused a collapse?
Look at Brazil in the late 1970s and early 1980s. For a long period, Brazil was the absolute darling of the developing world. I mean, their economy was growing at over 7% a year. Western banks were just pouring money into the country.
It was a bubble.
It was entirely debt-fueled growth. The Brazilian government was borrowing heavily from abroad to build infrastructure, but they had utterly failed to enact structural reforms. They hadn't restructured their land ownership, which remained deeply unequal, and they hadn't built globally competitive, export-driven manufacturing. They were just spending borrowed money.
So when the bill came due,
Exactly. When the global economic environment shifted and U.S. interest rates spiked in 1982, Brazil could no longer service its vast foreign debt. The illusion shattered. The country crumbled into severe currency depreciation, hyperinflation, and a devastating lost decade of zero growth. Growth rates alone are an extraordinarily dangerous metric if the underlying foundational structural transformation hasn't actually taken place.
the numbers today really speak for themselves when you compare the two sides of Asia. You look at Indonesia, with a GDP per capita hovering around $3,000 to $4,000, or Thailand around $5,000 to $7,000. Then you look at South Korea and Taiwan, rocketing well past $20,000 or $30,000.
It's a staggering difference.
And they all started from the exact same post-World War II baseline of profound poverty. The difference wasn't climate. It wasn't access to natural resources. It wasn't demographics. It was strict adherence to policy. And that brings us to the very first, most critical, and honestly most surprising step of this entire developmental blueprint. It doesn't start in a boardroom.
No, it doesn't.
It starts in the dirt. Let's talk about land policy. Why is dirt the ultimate deciding factor for a nation's wealth?
Well, we have to imagine the demographic reality of a country in the very early stages of economic development. Typically, upwards of 75% of the entire population lives and works directly on the land. Dirt is your primary overriding national resource. Therefore, the agricultural sector offers the single most immediate, profound opportunity to increase your total economic output.
Because that's where all your people are.
Exactly. If 3/4 of your citizens are farming, you need them to be as productive as mathematically possible. But here's the fundamental problem that early development faces. In deeply poor countries with rapidly growing populations, unregulated agricultural markets inherently and consistently fail.
Right, the market failure of early agriculture. When you leave things alone in a poor agrarian society where the population is expanding, the sheer human demand for land rapidly outstrips the available supply.
And we know what that leads to.
Universal landlordism, a very small elite fraction of the population, ends up owning almost all the arable land, and they lease it out to tenant farmers at exorbitant back-breaking rents. And because the landlords are the only ones holding the capital, they inevitably become the local moneylenders as well, charging usurious interest rates to the very people renting their land.
It's a trap.
The tenant farmer is completely trapped in a vicious cycle. They're paying exorbitant rents, they're saddled with unpayable debt, and they have absolutely zero legal security of tenure over the land they work.
Yeah.
Because they have no security and no spare cash whatsoever, they cannot possibly invest in things that would actually increase the yield of the land. They can't buy better fertilizer, they can't build irrigation channels, they can't get higher quality seeds.
And conversely, the wealthy landlord has absolutely no financial incentive to invest in improving the land's yield either. Why would a landlord go through the difficult, capital-intensive work of genuine agricultural improvement when they can make a fortune much more easily simply by squeezing the desperate tenants for ever higher rent and collecting exorbitant interest on predatory loans?
It's just easier to exploit the people.
Exactly. If a tenant has a bad harvest and defaults on a loan, the landlord simply seizes whatever small collateral the tenant has left, which is usually their last remaining fraction of land, further concentrating ownership into fewer and fewer hands. The free market, in this specific historical context, completely fails to maximize national output. You end up with stagnating or even falling crop yields, a starving population, and a society trapped in extreme, inescapable poverty.
But wait, hold on. Both free market capitalists and strict Marxists actually agree on one major thing, right? They both believe that scaled-up, heavily mechanized operations are the only true path to efficiency. I mean, we picture the American Midwest. Thousands of acres of golden corn, massive combine harvesters, one guy in an air-conditioned, GPS-guided tractor doing the work of 100 men.
The modern ideal.
Right. And you're telling me that for a developing country to get rich, it actually needs to go backward to tiny, isolated 2-acre plots. That sounds like a recipe for staying in the agrarian dark ages. How does that make any economic sense?
It sounds entirely backward until you redefine what efficiency actually means in that specific context. Efficiency is a highly relative term. It depends entirely on what specific resource you are trying to optimize. In a rich, fully industrialized country like the United States, human labor is incredibly expensive and relatively scarce compared to the sheer abundance of land.
Right, land is cheap, people are expensive.
So for the American farmer, efficiency means maximizing the yield per labor hour. You use million-dollar machines to replace expensive human workers, allowing one person to farm thousands of acres. But in a deeply poor, developing country emerging from war or colonialism, the economic reality is the exact polar opposite.
People are cheap. Land is scarce.
Yes. You have a profound surplus of human labor. Millions of people with no jobs, and a severe, critical shortage of arable land. In that specific environment, true efficiency means maximizing the yield per hectare of land, completely, regardless of how many labor hours it takes to achieve it. You have the labor sitting idle anyway. You might as well deploy it to squeeze every single calorie out of the dirt.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Studwell frames this in a way that completely shifted my perspective. He calls it the triumph of gardening. He argues we shouldn't even think of this as farming the traditional Western sense. We should think of it as large-scale, hyper-intensive gardening.
That's the perfect term for it.
Right. If you have a family of 6 people whose entire livelihood depends on tending to a single hectare of land, they aren't farming it with tractors. They're literally gardening it by hand. And anyone who has ever obsessed over a backyard vegetable garden knows that if you tend to a small patch of dirt with extreme precision, you can produce an absolute explosion of food.
The agronomic techniques detailed in the historical records are deeply fascinating because they are so astonishingly labor-intensive, yet so wildly, undeniably productive per square meter. When a rural family is tasked with maximizing a tiny plot, they don't simply broadcast seeds blindly into a plowed field.
No, they can't afford to waste a single seed.
Exactly. They start the seeds indoors in carefully managed trays, ensuring the seedlings are protected during their most vulnerable germination stage. They only transplant them into the outdoor soil for final maturation. They physically build raised beds or dig deep trenches to manually regulate the soil bed temperature, protecting the roots from frost or extreme heat.
If you read the actual accounts of how they were farming, It's wild. They weren't just throwing fertilizer around. They were treating these farms like delicate science experiments. They applied compost, plant by plant, placing the nutrients exactly at the root zone where it is needed, entirely eliminating waste.
Precision agriculture without the computers.
Exactly. They perform targeted, manual watering. They are constantly, meticulously weeding by hand. They use sophisticated planting techniques to create a solid leaf canopy. This means they plant crops so densely together that the mature leaves physically block the sun from hitting the exposed soil beneath them. This entirely natural canopy minimizes water evaporation and starves competitive weeds of sunlight. But of course, planting crops that densely means you can never possibly get a machine into the field. The entire harvest must be executed by hand.
They also heavily utilize vertical gardening. By manually constructing elaborate trellises, nets, strings, and bamboo poles, they force the crops to grow upwards, utilizing the empty airspace above the field. A single tomato plant, cared for in this hyper-intensive, individualized way, can yield upwards of 20 kilograms of fruit.
Unbelievable.
And then there is the practice of intergrowing. Farmers would plant radishes and carrots in the exact same furrow simultaneously. The radishes mature very quickly and are carefully harvested by hand just before the carrots grow large enough to be crowded out. It is a brilliant, highly sophisticated use of limited space, but again, utterly impossible to mechanize.
Studwell uses a fascinating modern-day analogy to prove the mathematics of this. He points to an American garden blogger named Roger Doyon. Doyon meticulously tracked the entire output of his tiny 160 square meter kitchen garden over a single season. Calculating based on standard retail prices, his little backyard plot produced $16.50 worth of food per square meter.
Which doesn't sound like a lot until you scale it.
Exactly. If you scale that math up, that equates to a staggering $135,000 of value per hectare. Compare that to wholesale American corn, grown on those highly mechanized, efficient farms, which only yields about $2,500 of value per hectare. It is a monumental difference in land efficiency. But of course, to achieve that $135,000 per hectare on a national scale, you would need an absolute army of gardeners working full-time, dawn to dusk, which is exactly what these developing Asian countries had, an enormous army of underutilized rural laborers.
What's fascinating here is the profound ideological paradox this historical reality creates. The forced redistribution of private land was often fiercely attacked, particularly by American politicians at the time, as backdoor insidious socialism. You are literally having the state confiscate private property from wealthy landlords and distributing it evenly to poor peasants, which sounds fundamentally Marxist.
Right, it's literally seizing the means of production.
Yeah. But the actual economic reality of what that redistribution created was the exact polar opposite of a centrally planned, stagnant socialist economy. By giving millions of rural families equal, tiny plots of land, equal starting capital, and equal access to local markets, these governments actually created conditions akin to the most idealized textbook free market capitalism you could ever possibly imagine.
Because suddenly everyone's an entrepreneur.
Exactly. You had millions of fiercely independent, equal players engaging in perfect competition with absolutely zero barriers to entry and identical starting resources. It was a pure, hyper-competitive, ruthless market that simply didn't exist anywhere in the industrialized West.
So you've got this staggering leap in food production. The historical data shows that within a single decade of shifting to small-scale household agriculture, the successful Asian states saw their gross national food output jump by 50 to 75%. That is an unprecedented leap in national wealth generation. But food isn't an iPhone. How does a surplus of radishes and rice turn into a modern, globally competitive industrial economy?
That's the core question.
Right. This agricultural abundance acted as the ultimate catalyst for the broader economy, creating 4 distinct ripple effects. Let's walk through those because this is the actual mechanical process of building a modern nation. The first ripple effect is rural consumption.
Exactly. When a government forcibly eliminates the parasitic landlord class, the tenant farmers suddenly get to keep the entirety of the surplus cash they generate from these newly booming crop yields. For the first time in history, you have a vast, sprawling rural population with actual discretionary money in their pockets.
And what do people do when they finally have money? They spend it.
They absolutely do. This fundamentally primes the pump of domestic economic demand. These farmers want to improve their lives. They want to buy consumer goods, bicycles to travel to market, radios for entertainment, better steel tools, corrugated roofing materials to replace thatched roofs. This sudden explosion of rural purchasing power creates a ready-made, highly lucrative domestic market for the country's fledgling manufacturing sector to sell into.
The corporate learning that happened as a direct result of this is mind-blowing. We all know giant global brands like Toyota, Nissan, and Honda today. But they didn't start out making luxury sedans for the affluent American market. They made their foundational fortunes and learned how to scale by aggressively adapting their products to this newly cash-flush but still highly rugged rural Japanese market.
They cut their teeth on the farms.
Right after World War II, Toyota and Nissan learned how to build robust, fiercely durable vehicles by manufacturing specialized trucks designed specifically to handle unpaved, deeply rutted Japanese farm roads. Honda literally got its start as a company by attaching tiny surplus 50cc radio generator engines to standard bicycles so that rural farmers could transport their heavy vegetable yields over hills more easily. These megacorporations learned the fundamentals of mass manufacturing, how to scale operations, and how to innovate by serving their own empowered rural farmers first.
The third major ripple effect is the critical protection of foreign exchange.
Wait, before we move on, let's clarify foreign exchange for anyone not dealing in global finance every day. Basically, if you're a developing country like post-war South Korea, your local currency is pretty much useless on the global market, right?
Yeah.
If you want to buy a high-tech German factory machine to build cars, Germany doesn't want your local currency. They want US dollars. So foreign exchange is essentially your country's savings account of globally accepted hard cash.
That is exactly right. A developing country desperately needs that globally accepted hard currency to buy advanced manufacturing technology, precision machinery, and specialized raw materials from the developed world. If your agricultural sector is failing and your country cannot grow enough calories to feed its own citizens, you have no choice but to spend your precious, limited foreign reserves importing basic food just to prevent widespread famine.
You literally eat your tech budget.
Exactly. But by maximizing domestic food output through household farming, these successful Asian nations fed their entire populations domestically. They hoarded their foreign exchange and deployed it strategically to buy the advanced factory equipment that rapidly propelled their industrialization.
It's brilliant. And Studwell makes a really sharp contrast here with Latin America to show what happens when you ignore this. He points to the development economist Michael Lipton's concept of urban bias. In Latin America, throughout the 1950s and 60s, the political elites, who largely lived in the capital cities, basically ignored the rural farmers. They didn't want to undertake the politically painful process of land reform. They just wanted to skip straight to urban industrialization.
Because factories look like progress.
Right, factories look great on a postcard. But because they ignored the dirt, as their economies grew slightly and their urban citizens wanted to eat more, especially meat, which requires significantly more land and grain to produce, their agricultural sector couldn't keep up. They had to start importing enormous quantities of food. This completely drained the foreign exchange they were desperately trying to earn from their industrial exports. They essentially strangled their own industrialization efforts because they didn't respect the foundational role of agriculture.
And finally, the fourth profound ripple effect of this agricultural boom is the organic creation of a robust social safety net. Developing countries typically do not have the tax base to support government-funded unemployment benefits, universal health care, or sweeping welfare systems. When a severe economic shock hits, urban factory workers who lose their jobs can be left completely destitute overnight.
Because there's no unemployment check coming in the mail.
Precisely. But in a country that has executed widespread, equitable household farming, the family farm acts as an extensive national economic shock absorber. When the global oil crisis hit in the 1970s, the entire world economy contracted, and factories across Taiwan were forced to lay off workers. 200,000 newly unemployed Taiwanese factory workers simply packed their bags, left the industrial cities, and returned to their family farms in the countryside.
They just went back to the farm.
They had a physical place to live, they had ample food to eat, and their physical labor could be immediately absorbed back into the intensive gardening demands of the farm.
They just went home.
Yeah.
Because they had legal ownership of land, they entirely avoided the absolute social catastrophe you see in other developing nations. When the economy crashes in places that stubbornly refuse to enact land reform, like the Philippines, or if you look historically at Britain during the brutal early years of the Industrial Revolution, you get sprawling, desperate squatter camps rapidly expanding around the periphery of the cities. You get extreme destitution, spiking crime rates, and severe political instability.
It tears the social fabric apart.
The equitable distribution of the family farm prevented all of that chaos in Northeast Asia. So we've got this great theory about gardening and rural wealth. But I always want to know how this actually looks in the real world. Where did we see this happen first? Didn't Japan effectively invent this playbook right after the Meiji Restoration? It's truly a tale of two Japans.
To deeply understand Japan's economic trajectory, we have to rewind the clock all the way back to the Meiji Restoration in 1868. At that specific moment in history, Japan was a deeply isolated, quasi-feudal society. The land was technically owned by the imperial state, but it was fiercely controlled by powerful feudal lords known as the daimyo.
Basically, local warlords.
Essentially, these lords operated vast, sweeping estates farmed by rural smallholders who were effectively tied to the land as serfs. The daimyo collected exorbitant, punishing rents in the form of physical crops, usually rice, and completely monopolized the regional grain markets. But the new, highly progressive Meiji government looked at the encroaching Western colonial powers and recognized that this stagnant feudal system was stifling the nation's ability to modernize and defend itself. So they instituted a sweeping, incredibly ambitious early land reform.
And the mechanics of how they achieved it were surprisingly modern. They didn't just execute the lords, they pensioned off the daimyo. They essentially paid them handsomely to step away from power, gave them prestigious seats in a newly created House of Peers in Tokyo, and then handed the actual physical legal title of the lands directly to the small farmers who worked them. They bureaucratically issued over 100 million individual certificates of land ownership in just 3 years.
A bureaucratic miracle.
And crucially, they fundamentally changed the tax system. Instead of the farmers handing over a physical percentage of their crop yield to a lord, the new imperial tax was a fixed, predictable amount paid in cash. This meant that if a farmer worked exhaustively and managed to double his crop yield, the tax stayed exactly the same, and he got to keep every single yen of the extra profit. The psychological incentive structure was completely revolutionized overnight.
This unleashed a staggering boom in national agricultural yields. From 1868 right up to the outbreak of the First World War, Japanese agricultural output surged continuously. The national population was growing rapidly, but domestic rice production essentially doubled, staying comfortably ahead of demand. Furthermore, the farmers utilized the marginal hilly lands that were unsuitable for rice to produce raw silk.
Ah, silk.
Yes, this silk became Japan's leading international export and generated the vast reserves of foreign exchange the government desperately needed. This immense agricultural surplus, heavily taxed by the Meiji government, directly funded Japan's incredibly rapid state-led industrialization. It allowed the Japanese state to buy modern warships, build sweeping railway networks, and rapidly construct a modern military that stunningly defeated both China in 1895 and the Russian Empire in 1905. It was the absolute foundation of their entire rise as a global imperial power.
But then we see the slow, creeping reversal. The system wasn't permanently insulated from market forces. By the 1920s, Japan's population was still booming, but they had essentially run out of new arable land to cultivate within their home islands. Simultaneously, the broader national economy was shifting. It was becoming steadily more expensive for rural families to buy the manufactured goods they now relied upon. So, if a family was burdened with a slightly smaller than average plot of land, or if they suffered through a single bad harvest due to weather, they had no choice but to borrow money just to survive the winter.
And who did they borrow from?
Right, they borrowed from their immediate neighbors who happened to have slightly more land and some spare cash on hand. Slowly but surely, the vicious cycle of rural debt skyrocketed. Farmer debt went up an astonishing 8-fold between the two world wars. When desperate farmers inevitably couldn't pay their mounting debts, they forfeited their land titles to the local lenders. Tenancy came roaring back with a vengeance. By the time the Second World War erupted, almost half of all arable land in Japan was back under the control of landlords, and 70% of all Japanese farmers were renting some or all of the fields they worked.
It was a disastrous structural return to profound market failure. The new class of landlords were back to extracting 50 to 60% of the physical crop in rent. The stark physical reality of this deep societal failure is perfectly encapsulated by the history of the Ito family home, located in Niigata Prefecture. The Ito family did not start as ancient nobility. They started as relatively normal, slightly more affluent farmers. But through generations of aggressive money lending and acquiring the forfeited land of their defaulting neighbors, they transformed into massive, deeply powerful landlords. By the 1920s, this single family owned 370 hectares of prime maize paddy and another 1,000 hectares of forest. They had an astonishing 2,800 tenant farmers working exclusively for them.
The description of their mansion is just haunting. You have to picture this contrast. A sprawling 60-room, 3-hectare palatial estate sitting right in the very middle of crushing rural poverty. The estate featured extensive ornamental koi ponds, a meticulously curated walking garden, elegant tea pavilions, and a soothing engineered waterfall. It looks like a place of absolute serene, refined culture. But every single stone of that estate was built entirely on the backs of thousands of starving tenants outside the walls, who were handing over more than half the food they grew just to avoid eviction. The social disconnect was so severe, so absolute, that the Ito family employed 80 distinct managers called banto, just to act as bureaucratic go-betweens.
80 managers just to collect the rent.
The landlords literally never even had to look their starving tenants in the eye to collect the rent. This crushing inequality, this return to feudal style, systemic exploitation, bred a deep, simmering resentment in the Japanese countryside. And it was exactly this resentment that the Japanese military expertly exploited in the 1930s, promising the rural youth salvation and glory to gain fervent, radicalized support for their march toward military dictatorship and war.
Which brings us to the devastated aftermath of World War II and the pivotal MacArthur intervention. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers occupying a defeated, smoldering Japan, was a deeply conservative military man. He was no socialist, but he was heavily advised by a brilliant, highly unconventional agricultural economist named Wolf Ladiginsky. Ladiginsky's personal backstory is deeply crucial here.
Let's actually pause and talk about Ladiginsky, because his journey is one of the greatest ironies of the 20th century. He was born in the Russian Empire in 1899. He personally lived through the chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1921. He watched as the communists swept across his homeland, and he fled as a refugee to the United States. But he observed something profound during that revolution. He realized the communists didn't win the hearts of the Russian people because the peasants deeply understood or cared about Marxist theory.
They just wanted to eat.
The communists won simply because they looked at starving, desperate tenant farmers and promised to give them the land. Ladiginsky realized that ideology doesn't win wars in the developing world. Bread does. Land ownership does. So he arrives in America, studies agricultural economics at Columbia University, works for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and eventually finds himself in Tokyo, advising MacArthur. He has to look a staunchly conservative, anti-communist American general in the eye and convince him that the only way to permanently defeat the threat of communism in Japan is to execute the most sweeping, radical redistribution of private wealth in Japanese history. It is a staggering historical paradox.
And Ladiginsky succeeds. He convinces MacArthur that breaking the entrenched power of the old rural elites is the only way to prevent the desperate poverty that inherently breeds communist uprisings. In 1946, under intense pressure from the American occupation, the Japanese government is forced to act. And the bureaucratic mechanics of this intervention were extraordinarily strict. They instituted a hard, non-negotiable limit of just 3 hectares per farm.
3 hectares, that's it.
If a family owned even an acre more than that, the government forcefully compelled them to sell the excess land to the state. They created highly empowered local land committees in every village to oversee the complex transfer of titles. And crucially, they specifically designed the legal makeup of these committees so that poor tenant farmers always mathematically outnumbered the wealthy landlords. The landlords were compensated for their seized property in 30-year government bonds. However, the post-war Japanese economy was experiencing such severe hyperinflation that the face value of those bonds was essentially rendered worthless almost overnight. It was, in pure economic terms, an unprecedented forced transfer of immense wealth from the rich directly to the poor.
Yet the astonishing part of this entire historical event is its sheer peacefulness. You had 2 million wealthy families losing their ancestral land and 4 million impoverished families gaining it. The Japanese Ministry of Agriculture fully anticipated widespread riots and hundreds of thousands of violent disputes. But across the entire nation, there were only 110 reported incidents of minor violence, and not a single life was lost.
Which is almost statistically impossible for an event of that magnitude.
The agricultural historian Ronald Dorr has a brilliant observation about the psychology of this. He notes that the newly empowered tenant farmers took the land, quote, half apologetically. Because the radical reform was imposed externally by the overwhelming force of the American occupying army, it entirely removed the direct personal conflict between the peasant and the landlord. The tenant could simply bow, shrug, and say, "I'm deeply sorry, I don't want to take your land, but the heavily armed Americans are making us do this." It was an amazing psychological trick of history that made an incredibly radical, deeply painful restructuring socially palatable for a defeated nation.
It was the necessary reset. Japan gets its second permanent agricultural restructuring, and the foundation for its legendary post-war economic miracle is firmly poured. But while America was politely and bureaucratically restructuring Japan, an entirely different, exceptionally violent version of land reform was taking place right next door on the massive scale of mainland China.
And here I want to pause and explicitly remind you, our listener, as we dive into the history of the Chinese Communist Party, we are maintaining strict, absolute neutrality. We are not taking sides, and we are absolutely not endorsing any political ideology, whether left-wing or right-wing. We are simply impartially analyzing the raw historical events and the resulting economic outcomes exactly as they are detailed in the historical source material we're reviewing. So with that framework in mind, what did the reality of rural China actually look like before the Second World War?
The conditions in pre-war rural China were horrific, far worse and far more desperate than anything experienced in Japan. The average life expectancy for a rural Chinese dweller was a staggering 20 to 25 years.
20 years old. That's just beyond comprehension.
The absolute poverty was so deeply entrenched, so crushing, that during the severe famines that swept through Shaanxi province in the 1930s, historical records indicate that an estimated 400,000 women and children were sold into outright slavery simply so their starving families could afford a few bags of grain to survive the winter. The agrarian researcher William Hinton documented details that are almost hard for a modern mind to comprehend, like desperate peasants literally engaging in physical fistfights over animal feces in the village streets because they so desperately needed any scrap of organic matter for fertilizer. The landlord class held absolute, unquestioned power, and their systemic exploitation of the peasantry was brutal and unrelenting.
Enter the Chinese Communist Party and their core rural strategy, a process they called fanshin. Fanshin literally translates to turn the body, but it was utilized as a powerful political metaphor for completely turning your life around, a total violent revolution of the established rural order.
Yeah.
And unlike the polite, paperwork-driven land reform in Japan, fanshin was visceral, chaotic, and deeply violent. William Hinton meticulously documented this process in a place called Longbow Village.
It was a very dark period.
After the Japanese surrender in 1945, the deeply trained CCP cadres moved into the villages and meticulously organized what they called struggle sessions. They violently dragged the landlords, the moneylenders, and the local elites out of their walled compounds and into the center of the village square. The peasants, who had suffered profound abuse and starvation under these specific individuals for generations, were encouraged to openly confront them. Mobs formed. Many landlords were brutally beaten to death by the very people who used to rent from them. The elites were stripped of absolutely all their property and dignity. The villagers literally took pickaxes and dug up the stone courtyards of the landlords' sprawling homes, desperately searching for buried silver bars and the hoarded cash profits of generations of usury. It was a terrifying, orchestrated explosion of deeply repressed generational vengeance.
It was undeniably brutal and deeply traumatic for Chinese society. But if we pull back and look strictly at the immediate, cold economic result of this incredibly violent redistribution, it was highly effective in achieving that crucial first step of our developmental blueprint. In 1947, the CCP issued a formal draft agrarian law, systematically confiscating all elite land and dividing it equally among the millions of poor peasants. Simultaneously, they instituted a progressive, highly incentivizing tax system. If a farmer worked hard and produced more grain than the local average, they got to keep the entirety of that excess yield tax-free.
Which is exactly what happened in Japan during the Meiji Restoration.
Exactly. Just as in the Meiji Restoration, this structural shift deeply incentivized the hyper-intensive gardening approach. The economic result was a sweeping, monumental agricultural boom. Between the late 1940s and mid-1950s, Chinese national crop yields surged by 40 to 70%. For a brief, shining moment in history, the vast Chinese peasantry experienced an unprecedented, joyous holiday from starvation. They had surplus food to eat, they had actual cash to spend, and vibrant rural industries and local markets began to rapidly bloom across the countryside.
But they didn't stick with it, did they? That's the tragedy here. Just when the exact right economic engine is humming, the ideology shifts.
Exactly. In 1956, Mao Zedong made a catastrophic, ideologically driven decision. He decided to entirely abandon this wildly successful, market-driven household farming model. Driven by rigid Marxist theory, he aggressively pushed for rapid nationwide collectivization. He forcefully ordered hundreds of millions of independent farming families to surrender their newly acquired land, pool their hand tools, and merge their labor into massive, state-managed collective farms.
They thought bigger was better.
He genuinely believed, ironically sharing the exact same fundamentally flawed assumption as the American proponents of mechanized megafarms, that vast scale was the absolute key to agricultural efficiency.
And the economic devastation this caused is almost unimaginable. By completely removing private ownership and the direct link between a farmer's labor and his family's survival, Mao entirely shattered the delicate psychological incentive structure of the gardening model. If you do not legally own the output of your specific tiny plot of land, you're absolutely not going to spend 12 hours a day painstakingly applying compost plant by plant or breaking your back weeding by hand in the hot sun.
The incentive is gone.
The meticulous, obsessive care required to maximize yield per hectare instantly vanished. National agricultural outputs plummeted dramatically. Combined with the other disastrous pseudoscientific policies of the Great Leap Forward, this sweeping collapse in food production led directly to a monumental, man-made famine between 1959 and 1961 that killed an estimated 30 to 40 million human beings. It remains one of the greatest tragedies in human history, driven entirely by strict ideological dogma, deliberately ignoring clear economic reality.
It is a profound tragedy. They held the exact recipe for prosperity in their hands. It was demonstrably working, and they discarded it for theory. It wasn't until decades later, in 1978, under the pragmatic leadership of Deng Xiaoping, who, in a fascinating twist of historical irony, was actually the son of a wealthy landlord himself, that China finally awoke from this ideological nightmare. Deng systematically dismantled the sprawling collective farms, returned the use of the land directly to the individual households, and instantly unlocked the staggering modern Chinese economic boom that has defined the 21st century.
So what does this all mean when we pull the lens back? We have Japan executing this blueprint peacefully under the direct supervision of an American military occupation. We have China executing it violently under the banner of a communist revolution. Let's look at the broader geopolitical chess game that was happening behind the scenes, because the United States government found itself trapped in a profound ideological dilemma regarding the rest of Asia.
This raises an important question about the fundamental contradictions of American foreign policy during the post-WWII era. The U.S. government was caught in a deep, agonizing contradiction. On one hand, the absolute, non-negotiable core value of the American capitalist identity is the strict sanctity of private property rights. The very idea of the state arbitrarily seizing private land from wealthy owners without paying fair market compensation is absolute anathema to the American system.
It goes against everything they stand for.
But on the other hand, they were facing the terrifying existential reality of the Cold War. They watched in horror as the Chinese communists successfully won the fervent loyalty of hundreds of millions of peasants simply by pointing at the landlords and promising the poor their land. The pragmatic, hard-nosed foreign policy experts in Washington slowly realized a terrifying truth. If the United States didn't aggressively offer a viable, non-communist version of land reform to heavily stabilize their fragile Asian allies, the entire region would inevitably fall to communist revolutions.
Let's look at the domino effect this realization caused. Start with the highly volatile Korean Peninsula.
In 1946, the Soviet-occupied northern half of the Korean Peninsula instituted a sweeping, largely peaceful, and wildly popular communist land reform. This bold move immediately forced the hand of the Americans occupying the southern half. The U.S. had carefully installed Syngman Rhee as the staunchly anti-communist president of South Korea. But Rhee's political power base was doubly allied with and funded by the wealthy Korean landlord class. Consequently, he fiercely and stubbornly resisted any American demands for land reform.
He didn't want to bite the hand that fed him.
Exactly. However, the political pressure emanating from the North's undeniable success was simply too great to ignore. Even the South Korean parliament, despite being heavily populated by landlords themselves, recognized the sheer existential threat of a peasant uprising and passed a preliminary reform bill. Yet, Rhee dragged his feet, utilizing every bureaucratic trick to delay implementation until the Korean War explosively broke out in 1950. At that exact moment of supreme crisis, land reform shifted from an economic debate to an absolute, non-negotiable requirement for national survival against the invading North, and the restructuring was finally aggressively pushed through.
And what about Taiwan? The situation there was equally dramatic. Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, had just comprehensively lost the massive Chinese mainland to Mao's communists and fled in desperation across the strait to the island of Taiwan. The U.S. government, which was heavily backing the Kuomintang financially and militarily through an organization called the Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, basically sat Chiang Kai-shek down and delivered an ultimatum.
And it was a harsh ultimatum.
They essentially told him, "You lost the entire mainland because you stubbornly ignored the desperate plight of the rural farmers. We're absolutely not going to let you lose this island too. You are going to execute deep land reform here immediately, or we are entirely pulling our financial and military support." The Kuomintang, recognizing their fragile position, listened. They systematically pushed through extensive land reform in Taiwan, compensating the landlords with shares in state-owned industrial enterprises and granting the physical land directly to the Taiwanese tenant farmers. And the result? Astonishing, world-class agricultural success.
Yes, Taiwan's trajectory is a perfect case study. They didn't just grow enough rice to feed themselves. Taiwan rapidly transformed into a global powerhouse in exporting highly lucrative, highly labor-intensive cash crops. Throughout the 1960s, they absolutely dominated the global export markets for things like canned asparagus, specialized mushrooms, and bananas.
Mushrooms and asparagus, that's so specific.
It is, but there's a reason. Why those specific crops? Because cultivating asparagus and mushrooms requires painstaking, hyper-intensive manual labor, the exact type of labor that their new household gardening model excelled at producing. The vast reserves of foreign exchange they generated from selling mushrooms directly funded the purchase of the advanced machinery that eventually built their world-class plastics and electronics industries. They literally built the foundation of their modern tech economy on the backs of mushroom farmers.
But didn't the United States eventually just give up on this incredibly successful strategy? It seems like they stopped pushing this blueprint globally once the immediate threat passed.
They did, and it is the great tragedy of this entire geopolitical narrative. The crucial context is that American support for radical land reform was a highly specific policy born entirely of Cold War panic, not of any deep, abiding economic conviction. Once the immediate, terrifying existential threat of communism sweeping the globe began to slowly fade, the United States entirely lost its political will to enforce these difficult property-seizing reforms among its allies.
So they just let it slide in places like Southeast Asia.
Exactly. So when it came to their other crucial partners in Southeast Asia, places like the Philippines, which was a former U.S. colony with deep ties to Washington, or South Vietnam, the U.S. entirely abandoned the strategy of heavily pressuring the local elites to redistribute land. They prioritized short-term political stability and let the deeply entrenched wealthy landlord classes remain firmly in power. And by fundamentally failing to force that first absolutely crucial step of agricultural restructuring, they effectively doomed the nations of Southeast Asia to vastly slower, highly unequal development. This policy failure directly birthed the profound systemic wealth disparities and the sprawling urban poverty we still clearly see in those countries today.
It is a phenomenal, deeply complex story of history, economics, and human behavior. So let's comprehensively recap this incredible, highly counterintuitive journey we've been on today. We started by asking a very simple question. How do deeply poor countries actually become rich? And the historical answer is that true, lasting economic development does not start with building gleaming glass skyscrapers in the capital city, and it certainly doesn't start with rapidly deregulating your national banking sector.
It starts in the dirt.
It literally, physically starts in the dirt. It requires a government to possess the sheer political will to violently break the ancient monopolies of the landlord class, to confiscate the physical land, and to distribute it equally to the poorest, most desperate citizens. It requires turning the concept of traditional farming into hyper-intensive small-scale gardening to squeeze every last possible ounce of yield from the available soil. The nations of Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and eventually China executed this painful first step, and upon that foundation they built the towering industrial powerhouses we see today. The nations of Southeast Asia refused to take that step, and they steadily fell behind.
And why should you, the listener, fundamentally care about this highly specific agrarian history today? Because deeply understanding this mechanical process equips you with a profound intellectual superpower. It actively allows you to see straight past the daily noise of modern political talking points. Whether a politician is fiercely preaching the absolute virtues of free market fundamentalism or passionately arguing for socialist collectivism, you can now clearly recognize that neither rigid ideology perfectly maps onto the messy, sheer, mechanical reality of how national wealth is actually generated from the ground up. True, lasting economic transformation always requires very specific, often highly uncomfortable, deeply structural interventions that simply refuse to fit neatly onto a political bumper sticker.
Exactly. It forces you to look at the mechanics, not the marketing. And that brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with, something to genuinely chew on long after this deep dive is over. We spent the last hour meticulously detailing how the foundational, indispensable step for the 20th century economic miracle was the radical, almost politically impossible redistribution of physical land to create perfect, equal market competition. Well, what is the structural equivalent for the 21st century? As we move deeper into a modern, increasingly digital and AI-driven global economy, is there a new form of digital land? Are things like vital intellectual property, vast exclusive troves of consumer data, or foundational access to highly advanced algorithms currently being heavily hoarded by a few massive modern-day corporate landlords? Will the next great global economic leap forward inherently require a new digital fashion? Will society eventually be forced to radically redistribute the intangible capital of the future to unlock the next great era of human prosperity and innovation?
It is a profoundly deep question. And when looking clearly at the harsh historical reality we've discussed today, the inevitable answer might be vastly more disruptive than any of us are currently prepared for.
Something to think about as you navigate the modern world. Thank you for joining us on this extensive journey. We absolutely love taking these deep dives and making sense of the complex world alongside you, discovering the hidden, often surprising mechanics of history. Stay curious, keep constantly questioning the widely accepted narratives, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.